Hi, everyone, and welcome to GLF Live. I'm Gabrielle Lipton, the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum, and we're here on this GLF Live to prepare for what's set to be one of the most important climate events in a long time, the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as COP26. It starts in Glasgow, Scotland on Monday, and the climate summit will run for 2 weeks and is expecting to see at least 10,000 delegates attending. But it's also a highly contentious COP for many reasons, as we are truly running out of time to limit emissions enough to keep global warming below what's said to be disastrous degrees. And additionally, the social equity aspects of this COP have been exacerbated by COVID-19, with many important participants, largely from traditionally marginalized groups, unable to attend due to vaccination requirements. So if anything says how divisive this COP is, it's that Greta Thunberg is boycotting the COP, and there are expected to be massive demonstrations in the streets, worker strikes, and all the like. So I will stop chatting now and rather turn our attention to our guest today, Stephen Leonard, an international lawyer and COP expert who's followed the negotiations closely for many years and has a deep understanding of what goes on behind closed doors at the COP. He's the founder of an international consulting firm, Rationale Advisors, and he sits on the board of multiple climate justice focused legal organizations, and he also advises various UN and civil society organizations. So normally I see Stephen at the COP themselves, but today it's great to have him here virtually to tell us what to expect and what some likely outcomes could be. So Stephen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Gabrielle. It's lovely to be here.
Great. So we will just go straight into the questions here, starting with the basics, which is the Paris Agreement, which was signed 5 years ago with countries committing to reduce their emissions to curb global warming. So in advance of this COP and at the 5-year mark, 114 countries and the EU have increased their nationally determined contributions, which are their commitments to reduce emissions, to the Paris Agreement. But these new commitments, even if fulfilled, are still not enough to keep global warming to the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is kind of the benchmark for keeping climate change in check. So what else needs to happen to achieve this main Paris Agreement goal?
So thanks. It's great. As I said, it's great to be here. And I think the starting point with this one is to be sort of thinking about where countries are currently at in terms of the what's called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And so the work that's been done in terms of the analyses on the current contributions from countries is putting the world on a trajectory of 2.7 degrees of warming as a global average, which is basically a catastrophe. And so when we look at those NDCs, it's also unlikely that they will be fulfilled in their entirety. A lot of the NDCs are also conditional. And so this then gets back to the question of climate finance. And as some viewers may be aware, there was a finance delivery plan that was delivered a couple of days ago, which basically confirms that the 100 billion, which is still much less than what's actually needed, is not going to be delivered until 2023. So there very much needs to be a paradigm shift in the approach to addressing climate change. We need to be getting out of the cycle that things have been in, which has been sort of year upon year of substandard and inadequate outcomes in these climate talks. And there needs to be an unprecedented international cooperation that begins to come through. I think that the recent pandemic was an indication in some ways as to how there can be some level of international cooperation, but it also, I think, provided a lot of insights into the level of inequality that we see between the rich countries and the poorer countries, which also very much plays out in the context of climate change, which we can talk about a bit more. as we go. Another issue there around finance and the impacts on vulnerable countries is issues around debt. There are some interesting initiatives coming out around sort of debt for climate swaps and innovative approaches that could play an important part. But overall, there very much needs to be a very significant increase in political will to be addressing climate change. The level of ambition that we are seeing at the moment is just really quite inadequate, and a lot of excuses are used around sort of there's not enough public finance and this but if we look at the issues around public finance, we can compare perhaps to the military budget for the US for 1 year is in the vicinity of about $700 billion per year, but the whole world is struggling to come up with $100 billion between them. And another important thing I think going forward is that we need to start thinking beyond what I think is being recognised more and more as sort of a disaster capitalism approach to addressing climate change. Of course, companies need to be becoming more sustainable and sort of we need to be cleaning up supply chains, and so there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of important things that need to be done in terms of a shift from private sector. But we need to be sort of moving beyond the thinking of what are the sort of opportunities there in terms of being able to really sort of profit from some of the approaches to climate change, because I think that in a lot of circumstances some of the conversations get a little bit hung up on that. And I think the carbon trading discussion is perhaps one of them, where there's been very significant amount of resourcing invested in carbon trading, which basically doesn't reduce emissions. It's about offsetting in a lot of circumstances, not all, but a lot of circumstances. And so we need to be very much moving into a space which is very about reducing emissions, and governments need to be very much more accepting their responsibility, and especially those in the global north, which are the countries that are most responsible for causing climate change.
Thank you for that really comprehensive answer that touched on so many topics, from carbon markets, which we'll get to political will, which definitely needs to be increased. I appreciated your optimism about how COVID-19 has seen countries come together in some ways, and maybe we can unpack that a bit later and what that could bring for the COP and some positive outcomes. But you also mentioned the US and how the staggering fact of how much it spends 7 times more than what's needed just for a single country on its own military. And so maybe let's go to the global powerhouses, specifically the US and China, and what they're doing at this COP and generally with their emissions reductions. They've both made major pledges and have been continuing to update them recently, especially with the Biden administration, first of all, rejoining the Paris Agreement after Trump pulled the US out of it, and also committing to cut the US's emissions in half this decade and shift the entire energy sector to renewables by 2035. So that's what the US has committed to do. And then China's committing to be entirely carbon neutral by 2060, even though its emissions are still on track to peak before then during this decade. So that's a brief summary of what these two global powerhouses are doing. Is that enough action from these two major countries?
So, I mean, the experts that are looking at this, so I'm obviously led by experts in China and in the US, but based on what I'm seeing coming out of those countries, there is more that needs to be done, and this is of course reflected in the current NDCs. I mean, China have made a very significant announcement recently in relation to investments in overseas coal, where they'll be ceasing investments in overseas coal. So that's a very big deal. But the details of what that looks like still need to be unpacked to some extent. But in terms of China's new NDC, experts basically saying that it does still fall short, and that the carbon neutrality target that's been set needs to be backed up. So there's not enough sort of backup in terms of how this will be achieved in realistic terms, which we actually see as the case in a lot of countries. And the peaking by 2030 is something that's very much focused on there, and that's also considered to be insufficient, with calls being made for China to peak earlier in 2025, which a lot of experts also think is also possible. So we may see some more movement in terms of China's ambition. In terms of the US, the re-entry into the Paris Agreement, in some ways, it almost feels like they never left. I mean, it was a short space of time, and in the negotiations, in the climate negotiations, you still do see US negotiators involved in the process in a lot of the spaces, which is a bit of a complicated issue to get into. But also we saw a very significant mobilization in the US of local governments, and I think that was very much a testament to the importance of addressing climate change at the community and at the grassroots level. But I think the main initiative, or the main effort that the US are probably coming into Glasgow with, is the Build Back Better plan, or the Build Back Better law, which again is being considered by experts as very much falling short. And just to give one indication, I think that Biden was hoping for a plan that had a budget of around $3 or $3.5 trillion. But the end result was more in the vicinity of just under 2 million. I think about 1.75 trillion. Sorry, I said million. So 1.75 trillion. So again, we see this situation time and time again, where there is sort of ambitious plans that are being put forward, but then as a result of political processes within countries, things get very much watered down, and we also see this in the climate negotiations. But sort of moving beyond just China and the US, I think that it's probably also worthwhile to be thinking about the G20. I'm seeing a lot more coming out at the moment, which is putting emphasis on the group of the 20 sort of richest, highest emitting countries, and because the G20 amongst themselves make up 75% of global emissions, and so there's a recent study that was released from WRI and Climate Analytics, which basically says that if there is sort of emphasis on 2030 targets within the G20 context, then that can get the world on track to be achieving the below 2 or 1.5 degrees. And so I think that coming out of Glasgow, which I expect to be very much sort of a call for more to be done, I'm not really expecting Glasgow or announcements in Glasgow to put the world on track. I think that we're too far gone, and we've already had the announcement on finance, which is a failure. Anyway, but I think that there will be this sort of call for getting things on track, and so I think that the G20, in 2022, which we sort of led by Indonesia, will be something to watch going forward.
Mm-hmm. Are there specific countries within the G20 or otherwise that are going to be facing more pressure than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of the countries in the G20 will have a lot of pressure on them. Something interesting that was released prior, or just in the last few days, was a ministerial statement from like-minded developing countries, which looks at the issue of net zero and equity. And the position that's being made there is that the net zero by 2050 goal doesn't apply to all countries equally. The net zero by 2050 goal is something which is a global goal in the Paris Agreement, which is correct. It is a global goal, and it's just simply not fair to be expecting for some countries to be achieving net zero by 2050. And so that then puts the responsibility more on countries such as the US and others. But I think Australia is going to be my own country, which I no longer live in. But I think Australia is going to have a lot of pressure on them with their recent announcement around net zero by 2050, which is not really backed up by anything, including no plan to be cutting pollution around coal or gas. It's a very weak target. I think that Brazil are going to be feeling a lot of pressure, given that the Brazilian NDC actually goes backwards and is perceived as being a reduction in ambition. And there's also been an increase in deforestation in Brazil, which is attracting a lot of attention. But most of all, I think the UK is going to be under a lot of pressure. Leadership is expected from a COP presidency. And the UK is under a lot of criticism for pending approvals around the Canberra oil field is coming up a lot. It's a very significant oil field owned by Shell, and it was just revealed in the last couple of days that there are 40 new coal, oil and gas extraction projects which are in the pipeline to be approved by 2025, which is completely inconsistent with the International Energy Agency pathway to 1.5, which is that there should not be any new investments in fossil fuels as of now. So this really calls into question the leadership of the UK.
Mm-hmm. So the UK, Australia, Brazil, and then of course the US and other countries. And the first 2 days of the COP will they're the World Leaders Summit, and so we'll keep an eye out then for what leaders are telling us they're going to do. You mentioned a bit, and I mentioned a bit in the intro, the imbalance a bit of who's going to have a seat at the table at this COP, and how marginalized groups and people who need a voice most might not be present at all or in small groups for the negotiations due to COVID restrictions. What effect is this going to have on the outcomes?
So, I mean, I think that it's probably worthwhile giving some credit to the UK in their efforts to make the conference accessible under very difficult circumstances. However, I think that it was very much a situation of perhaps a little bit too little, too late. I mean, I think that the difficulties with being vaccinated and with countries that were on the red list, and most of those countries were removed from the red list only in the last sort of week or two, I believe. People generally organise themselves to attend these sorts of events, months in advance, and including registrations for accreditation to the event and the like. And so there just wasn't time for a lot of organisations and individuals to organise themselves to attend. But I think that there were also some inequalities in terms of the measures that were taken. I know that the AstraZeneca vaccination was one of the vaccination measures that were provided, and they only allowed for, I think, about a 4-week interval between the first and second shot of the AstraZeneca vaccination, whereas the recommended time period is between 8 to 12 weeks. And so essentially, that's expecting for people from vulnerable countries to put themselves more at risk to be participating in this, which I think is one of the sort of indicators of inequality in terms of what's expected here. In terms of what I may expect to be an impact on the outcome, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that these negotiations are already unequal, and there's a lot of inequalities that exist within the negotiations. And just as a sort of a big picture point to make, most of them occur in English, and that then puts a lot of countries very much at a disadvantage from the outset. And countries have had a very sort of uphill battle on things that are more important to the global south, such as adaptation and loss and damage. And so, I think that we, these issues will continue to really be major problems. And so I think what we're going to see in Glasgow around this, as a result of this sort of inequality, is that the potential for decisions that are more favourable to the global north. So I think that the delivery of the finance delivery plan, not meeting the target, is something that is perhaps done because countries feel that they can get away with it, and so because there's not going to be a huge amount of pressure there from the global south. And I think getting away with not having enough ambition, this is something that again is very much on countries from the global north. And then I think the Article 6 negotiations, which is around sort of international cooperation, and some see it only as being about carbon trading. Again, if there is an outcome there, which is basically about being able to offset your emissions and trade carbon to allow for the wealthy, high emitting countries to be continuing to do what they're doing and just buy their way out. I think that again, if it's not an equitable outcome on Article 6, then that could be something that could be perceived as being more sort of leaning in favour of the global north. So I think that it's going to be important to be keeping an eye on the outcomes in terms of to what extent they do very much sort of favour the global north in circumstances where it's been so challenging for global south representatives to attend.
Thank you. And you touched on Article 6, which is where I would like to go next. And for those who don't know, Article 6 is a specific section of the Paris Agreement that deals with, as Steve said, international agreements on some measures, but it is largely interpreted to be about carbon markets and carbon trading. And it's the last part of the Paris Agreement that has not yet made it into the Paris Rulebook, which is a set of rules devised around different articles for how they'll be implemented, which is basically to say that there hasn't been a common agreement between parties on how to create rules to govern international carbon markets. And that's been outstanding for a few COPs now. It was highly negotiated last COP, still with no outcomes. Stephen, do you think there are going to be any outcomes or any rules made for this article this year?
So with Article 6, I think it's important to put it into context. I think there are a lot of expectations here that there's going to be some big global carbon market that's launched that then sort of triggers all this sort of activity. But there are many more rules and sort of methodologies and approaches and things that do need to be created, even if there's an outcome based on the current text that they have before them. So it's actually a number of years off before this new mechanism, as it's called, would be implemented. So what I think we can probably expect at COP26 is the launch of a shell of Article 6. So it's sort of the sort of an outline, we might want to call it, in terms of text. The establishment of a supervisory body, some of the governance arrangements, and broad overarching rules and some definitions. The number of work plans that then get launched for more work to be done in coming years. And so, as I said, I think it'll be several years before transactions are actually really occurring within that system. It's worth noting that there are some countries that are beginning to come together and come up with some bilateral agreements, which they're saying are aligned with Article 6, but within the system that they're developing within the UNFCCC, it's still a number of years off.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. I'd like to also go back to another topic that you mentioned before, which is loss and damage, which concerns the ways in which countries facing the impacts of climate change the most will be compensated and helped. This also ties into the financial package that you mentioned. So there aren't obligations for major countries to do so, to extend a helping hand, often financially, to countries on the front lines of climate change. How do you expect to see this issue addressed, if at all?
So I mean, I noticed that there's also a point in here from Adugna in terms of compensation, and maybe we can address that point at the moment. I mean, the idea of any compensation for loss and damage was ruled out in Paris. This was one of the last minute outcomes in the Paris negotiations to reach an agreement there, that there is to be nothing sort of characterized as compensation, and that was very much just one step in a long campaign that has been run by developed countries to block any sort of finance for loss and damage. And I think it also needs to be put in context that the situation in terms of climate impact is already upon us, and it's very dire. The Red Cross have identified that in the past decade, extreme weather events have killed more than 400,000 people. There's over 1 billion people that are being impacted already, and now we have this on top of the impacts in the global south of the pandemic. And I think that the social and economic impacts of the pandemic in developing countries is something that I think is still very much unknown. I don't think that we know the true impact, and so the situation is very problematic. And I expect there to be a continual blockage on this. The developed countries, I don't see any indication that there's going to be a shift on some of this, although it would be great if there was. But there has been this continual blockage. There are some interesting calls that are coming out on loss and damage. and what some organisations would be hoping for, and that is to very much be delivering on finance around loss and damage during COP26, and the calls there are for that finance for loss and damage to be additional to the $100 billion that has been proposed. And there's also a call there that's been made, I think, by WWF calling for a finance facility on loss and damage to be put in place, which would also be an interesting development. So it's very much going to be around delivering on finance for loss and damage, and to be moving beyond just discussions and undertaking research, and moving into some real delivery of finance.
Okay, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. You mentioned before that countries have committed to contribute $100 billion each year for climate action in developing countries. Currently, estimates are that they're falling short by about 20 billion each year still. So even that financial target isn't being met, let alone a different mechanism on loss and damage. How do you expect these financial gaps to be filled, if at all, and who will step in to fill them?
So, I mean, again, so going back to the point that I was making about this dependence on private sector that we're seeing, we're going to see a lot of that at this COP. So there's this initiative called the Race to Zero, which is looking at private sector involvement and net zero. And we've been hearing for calls for more private sector finance and scaling up of private sector finance around forests and REDD+, which is the UNFCCC initiative to reduce deforestation. But there needs to be a shift away from this, and again, it goes back to the role of countries and public finance. I raised the issue of the comparison with US military spending, because the money is there. But the problem is that the political will isn't, and this sort of shift to emphasis on the private sector, is a reflection, of that, and I think that this is something. So if we take the protection of forests, all of the science, points to protecting natural ecosystems as essentially being the sort of number one priority when it comes to climate action in the land sector. But it's very difficult for companies to make a business case on protecting ecosystems. The restoring ecosystems and sequestration is an easier sort of business case to make if you're looking at sequestration and carbon credits and other things that can be factored in when it comes to landscape restoration. But when it's simply protecting areas, it's quite difficult to make the business case on that, and so it doesn't get. And it's also difficult to make the carbon or the mitigation case on that on the basis that it's potentially not additional, and so there are some problems there in terms of bringing the private sector on board. And so, I'm of the view that there needs to be much more emphasis on non-market approaches and looking at alternative sources of finance. There's been a number of studies done looking at levies on aviation, levies on fossil fuel production, taxing the super rich, financial transaction taxes, a global carbon tax. Some of these, there's been analyses that show that these sorts of approaches can raise hundreds of billions of dollars, and could raise that sort of money annually. And so I think that there needs to be more conversation around how to be drawing on some of these potentially faster and more efficient ways of generating public finance to be going into climate.
Mm-hmm. So looking beyond just our governments and other industries that are often causing climate change and not paying the price for it. You were talking about ecosystem restoration as well and ecosystem management. And I think that leads perfectly into another topic that has been gaining a lot of attention in the past couple of years, which is great, which is nature-based solutions to climate change. So ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change using ecosystems, using nature, protecting nature, restoring nature. Do you think these are going to be discussed in the negotiations much or formalized in any way?
At this nature, forests, land use. I mean, this it always comes up in one way or another. The UK is going into this event with nature as a bit of a priority, but it's worthwhile, I think, exploring the different approaches that could be taken here. The nature-based solutions approach, which is something that has come up, more in the last few years, and hasn't really been explored in terms of what it actually means within the UNFCCC. So there are some issues there around definitions and what nature-based solutions means, and then there's also some questions around, whose solutions are we actually talking about? When you have shale oil promoting nature-based solutions as a way of sort of offsetting emissions, generating carbon credits for sort of essentially zero-sum offsetting, it does need to be, the question does need to be raised as to whether or not they were talking about a solution for the fossil fuel industry, or whether we're talking about solutions for the rest of us, or even for communities or for biodiversity. And so there are a number of different layers here in terms of this conversation around nature-based solutions. And it's come up in some other spaces as well, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, in terms of using this terminology. And some people perceive nature-based solutions as being sort of an extension of the REDD+ forests mitigation focus, which is sort of expanding now to all of nature and to all ecosystems. I mean, the IMF even have sort of a proposal out there related to whales and offsetting, which is sort of getting into the sort of realm of ridiculousness. So this sort of net zero by 2050, nature-based solutions, nature-based offsetting, discourse is pretty challenging, especially when there's a potential for a very significant amount of carbon offsets. And so some would prefer to maybe be thinking more along the lines of ecosystem-based approaches, as is defined and well understood in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there are also some very strong calls from both the UN Climate Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity for there to be more sort of cooperation and interaction between these two UN sort of bodies. And so thinking perhaps more along the lines of ecosystem-based approaches, might be less problematic, and we might see some sort of outcome sooner, but we'll see where it goes. It will come up in a big way. I think this argument is going to be something that comes up in the COP. But I do think that there will be sort of a high-level decision that comes out specifically on nature and on the role of natural ecosystems. And it's also important there to emphasise that that natural ecosystems and forests, and restoration, protection, that shouldn't be happening in place of reductions in fossil fuel emissions. So this gets to the offsetting issue. We should be focusing on real permanent emissions reductions across the board in terms of fossil fuel emissions, and restoring and protecting ecosystems as much as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, those definitely need to go hand in hand, and it will be interesting to see what outcomes there are for this. I know that the three Rio conventions are trying to synergize, for lack of a better word, much more, and maybe this is a point of intersection for them. I'll take this moment. I know we have plenty of people listening in. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat on whatever platform you're listening in from. I'll be happy to pose Stephen some questions that aren't mine. We have one now from Violetta from the World Trade Organization, and it's a bit technical. I'm not going to pretend to quite understand. So Stephen, I'll leave it to you to explain the context. But she's asking for your thoughts on what the Forum on the Impact of the Implementation of Response Measures at COP26, which are tasked to manage the discussions on border carbon adjustments, BCAs. So what are going to be the discussions, and what should we look out for around this topic?
Response measures is an interesting, it's an interesting space within the negotiations. I think that it was originally moved forward in the negotiations by some sort of major fossil fuel countries that were sort of looking to be sort of compensated. I wasn't involved in the negotiations at that point. This is going back a long way. But there were some fossil fuel countries that I think were looking to be sort of compensated for having to reduce their fossil fuel usage. So the response measures issue has been something that has been within the negotiation space for I've been involved for more than a decade, and this was going on before I was in there. So it just keeps on coming up and sort of evolving into into new spaces. But it's very much the issue of equity comes up a lot in terms of response measures and who should or shouldn't be responding, and this also comes up in the context of sort of border carbon adjustments. I've noticed that there's been sort of an equity issue that's been raised there in terms of sort of international trade and sort of how accessible some of this. I mean, I see a lot of that coming up within that sort of equity conversation. So I think that the issue, again, going back to this sort of an overarching issue within the negotiations around equity in this particular session, I think that we're going to probably see questions around equity and responses come up more as well. But I mean, the response, just to add to that, the response measures track of the negotiations isn't one of the sort of major tracks of the negotiations either. I mean, it might be sort of building in terms of its momentum, but it's one of these things that just sort of stays there and people keep talking about it, but we don't seem to see sort of something of major significance come out of it. So I'll just add that as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for responding to Violetta's question so thoroughly. This COP is going to be unique as well for the social aspect, as I mentioned before, and there are going to be worker strikes and protests and boycotts of the COP. How do you think these social reactions, what are they saying about political leadership? And how do you expect this public outcry to be taken into account in these negotiations? It's really hard to ignore at this point after years of the climate movement just growing and growing.
Yeah, I mean, the social movements on the outside, what we might want to call, working on sort of the outside space are really extremely important, because the accessibility to these events is limited, for reasons in terms of venue capacity at this particular COP. They need to be implementing social distancing and the like, and so accessibility is limited, and so it's very important that there are very strong social movements that are happening on the on what we might want to call the sort of the outside. In terms of the boycott, I mean, I think Greta was talking about a boycott, but then she sort of moved back on that one. And there's been a few conversations about potential boycotts. I mean, I think a boycott may be, if there was a full-blown boycott, it might be something that sort of shakes the process up enough to see some change in momentum. But we'll see what's happening. But I think it's a bit unfortunate that that the social movements have to be sort of working so hard and to be sort of working to be heard in circumstances where we know what the problems are, and we know the extent of the problems, yet we still have to be sort of screaming to be heard, to be essentially putting in place measures to be saving ourselves. I think it's very unfortunate, and I'm also really surprised often when I hear reference to movements like Extinction Rebellion and others as being sort of radical. It's for some bizarre reason it's radical to want to save ourselves. If you ask me, I think that ongoing and unlimited exploitation and exploration of fossil fuels, knowing that this is going to destroy our own habitat, is pretty radical. Or continuing to sort of deforest the world's natural ecosystems is a pretty radical thing to be doing. So I think that there's some sort of narrative issues that come up there that quite deliberately try to portray some of the social movements in a somewhat of a negative light, which I certainly do not agree with. But in terms of the way that then converts, or the social movements on the outside then converts to inside, to the negotiations themselves. I mean, the UN security and police in the country really do try hard to make sure that those social movements are sort of kept as far away as possible. But I think that they may have a lot on their hands at this particular event. We're seeing a lot more creativity coming up in terms of actions that are being undertaken, and I guess we can only hope that the message is heard loud and clear, on the inside of this particular negotiation.
Mm-hmm. I hope so too. I'm very curious to see how it's going to play out. I'll ask you one more question. I know that we've been going for quite a while, and I would imagine it's what many people are wondering, which is in regard to just the Paris Agreement overall. As these social movements show, as many people feel faith in these agreements, it's dwindling. Would you rather see renewed faith in the Paris Agreement or some sort of new agenda or major new outcome formed? Just generally, Stephen, what are your hopes for this COP?
Yeah, I mean, on the point about a new, if there was to be some sort of a new agreement, I mean, we worked towards getting the Paris Agreement for I mean, for a very long time. I mean, we were sort of working up to that in Copenhagen in 2009. That failed. We then didn't end up getting the Paris Agreement until 2015. I think there was around a sort of a decade of work to get to that. So any new treaty around climate change, would take a very long time. And I'm not really sure whether or not we would get anything better than what we currently have. At this point, maybe, I'm not sure, but that's an interesting thing to think about. But overall, I think international cooperation is something that definitely does remain important, and we need to see enhanced cooperation amongst countries in a way that's sort of unprecedented in human history. I think we saw the way that countries can cooperate when it comes to sort of aviation and shutting down airlines and borders and things, and then reopening as well, sort of entry into sort of lists and limiting access in terms of the pandemic. But I also think that the pandemic really showed the level of sort of ongoing discrimination that exists. Things like the hoarding of vaccines. I mean, here in Indonesia, I think we're only at 25% of the population being fully vaccinated, which means that there are 200 million people here in Indonesia who are unvaccinated, and at the same time, a lot of countries are onto their sort of third shot, and boosters. So these inequalities are, I think, indicators of a lack of international cooperation. And so we need to be really enhancing that international cooperation, which then goes to Article 6 as well, which is essentially about international cooperation. Article 6, shouldn't be just about carbon markets. It should be, and it doesn't say just carbon. It doesn't say carbon markets at all in Article 6. It talks about adaptation, it talks about technology transfer, capacity building, finance, and it talks about mitigation. And so there should be a more equitable approach to Article 6 in a way that really enhances international cooperation between countries. So I don't think that the Paris Agreement is the problem. I think that I think there's a major lack of political will and sort of courageous, sort of brave leadership out there when it comes to politics. I think that the system that we exist in puts far too much emphasis on economy over lives. I think this was another thing that we saw during the course of the pandemic, which probably resulted in a lot more sort of death and destruction than what we probably would have liked to have seen. I think that we need to be thinking about the extent to which there's sort of engagement and influence over these processes. The companies, and the countries we saw recently with the leak of the IPCC process. There is active engagement in terms of trying to dilute and stymie developments on climate sort of action. So that something needs to be done about that, and those sorts of efforts to undermine climate outcomes need to be banned in these processes. But I hope that in the wake of the pandemic, we are moving in a direction of more sort of equity, fairness, and justice within these processes. And in terms of what I would hope to see come out of the Glasgow COP is, I think it would be good if there was some sort of a high level pact that was formed, or some sort of a declaration that was made at a high level that could put us on a course correct. I think what we're going to see here is very much a recognition of how off track we currently are when it comes to the NDCs and finance and the like. And so there needs to be a course correct and a realistic roadmap that is to be putting things back on track, and that could be something that is done between preferably all countries, but it could even be done by the highest emitters, and so some sort of a pact or some sort of a declaration that could then be sort of built upon going forward and relied upon as well would possibly be a decent outcome.
Thank you, Steve. That would indeed be an excellent outcome, and I hope to see something similar myself and have a reason to have our faith renewed in the next 10 years being more promising than the last few in terms of commitments to really changing the course of our climate. Stephen, it's been such an interesting discussion with you today. I've learned so much, and I've taken notes for my own understanding of this year's negotiations, and look forward to seeing you on the other side and discussing some of the outcomes. I'd also like to thank everyone listening today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this conversation. And as my colleague, I believe, is dropping in the chat, my organization, the Global Landscapes Forum, is hosting a 3-day event alongside the COP. If you're not there in person, it's fine. Everything is accessible, fully digital. So wherever you are in the world, you can tune in. So the link for that, if you'd like to book a ticket, is events.globallandscapesforum.org/climate-2021. That's our event, and you can find us there and join us. Stephen, thank you again for joining us. And
thanks, Gabrielle. It's been great to see you and great to catch up and speak about this. And thanks to the GLF. Unfortunate that I won't be there in Glasgow this year, but good luck with everything, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining GLF Live.